Hello everyone. Today we are going to learn what is the significance of the startup class in an ASP.NET Core application. As we are aware that the startup class is a very important part of an ASP.NET Core application. Any ASP.NET Core project must include a startup class. As the name suggests, it is executed when the application starts. The startup class can be configured using the useStartup extension method. The name startup is by ASP.NET Core convention. Otherwise, we are free to name the class whatever we want to name. The only thing to keep in mind while changing the conventional name startup is to specify it as a generic parameter in the useStartup method. For example, to rename the startup class as myStartup, we can specify it as myStartup. We can go ahead and create an instance of this myStartup class. So now we have a new startup class which we will have to populate as per the .NET Core conventions. Now let us revert our changes and stick to the same startup name for our startup class. Now we'll take a look at the actual startup class. When we look at the startup class which we got, we can see that there are two important methods which are part of the startup class. First one is the configure services method and the second is the configure method itself. Here, if we see at the comments, it is written that this method gets called by the runtime. Use this method to add services to the container. So basically, the configure services method is used to register the services which will be used in the application or throughout the application. So as we all are aware that ASP.NET Core has a built-in support for dependency injection. Hence, if any of the component or any class has a dependency on a particular service, we can go ahead and register that service inside this configure services method, and the IOC container will inject that dependency in the specific class which asks for it. So this particular method, the configure services method, receives iService collection as a parameter. The iService collection is the collection in which we need to register our additional services which we want to register with the IOC container. Now coming to the configure method, this method is also called by the runtime, and we are supposed to use this method to configure the HTTP request pipeline. So this particular method, which is the configure method, is receiving iApplication Builder and iWebHost environment as its parameters. So what happens in this case is we are supposed to specify the request processing pipeline inside this configure method. By doing so, we also specify how the request will be processed going forward whenever the request is received by the application. In addition to this, any service which we have registered in the configure services method is also available in the configure method. As this method is called by the runtime after the configure services method has been executed. So all the services which are registered as part of configure services are available to be used in the configure method. The only thing which we have to do is we need to specify that particular service in the method's parameters. For example, if I try to inject a scoped service, and whenever I specify a service, please try to understand it as a class itself. A service is in itself a class, an instance of a class, and the entities which have a dependency on a service are actually dependent on the functionality which are exposed by that particular class. So for example, I have a service which is my personal logger service, which will provide the functionality of logging here, which is also implementing the interface iLogger service. And I want to register that particular service to be used by any entity inside this particular application. So what I can do is if I want to add a scoped instance of that particular service, I can go ahead and register that in the IOC container. So here I have registered my personal logger as a service. So any class which requests for this iLogger service, an implementation of iLogger service, will be injected with an instance of my personal logger, and it can go ahead and use the functionality which is exposed by my personal logger in it. And if I want to use this logger service inside this configure method, all I have to do is add it in the list of all the parameters which are getting passed to the configure method, and I can go ahead and start using this logger service inside this method as well. In addition to this, the configure method is, as we have already discussed, is used to configure the middleware. For example, use routing is a middleware. If we go to its definition, we can see this particular method is used to add endpoint routing middleware to the specified Microsoft application builder. This is the usage of the configure method. You can include only the middleware components which are required by your application and thus increase the performance of your application. By default, the configure method has three middlewares, which is use developer exception page, use routing, and use endpoints. Among these three, the use developer exception page is a conditional middleware which is only available when we are running this application in the development environment. And this particular middleware is used to get the detailed exception information. If we go to its definition, we can read that this particular middleware captures synchronous and asynchronous system.exception instances from the pipeline and generates HTML error responses. So this is more inclined towards the developers who can be benefited from a more detailed exception report with all the messages, which can be very handy when they are trying to debug the issues in the application. I hope the short video about startup class was helpful to you. Thank you.